Okay, good evening everybody, or good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you once again for joining us today, wherever in the world you're calling from. My name's Graham Canning. I'm from People-Centered Excellence. It's my pleasure to be hosting this webinar today. This is the fourth of the webinars in our Out of the Crisis series, and this one promises to be something very special, I think. So we've got the pleasure of introducing and talking with leadership coach, Japan study tour leader, lean consultant, speaker, and now author, Katie Anderson. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Grim and Mike. Good to see you.
We've also got this handsome chap who's joining me is my PCE colleague, Mike Dennison. Some of you may remember Mike, you may know Mike. Mike presented an earlier webinar in our series on leading with questions. Mike's going to help me run the webinar today and join in the Q&A session at the end of Katie's presentation. So say a quick hi, Mike.
Hi, good to be on it. Looking forward to this.
So,
can't wait, Katie, what you've got to say.
Always for time about certain lean leaders being generous with their time and finding time to help and support. And Katie just, exemplifies that attitude. So we're really thankful for the support she's shown us on this one. So anyway, enough from me. It's time to hand over to Katie. So Katie, over to you.
Well, thank you, Graham. It was a really amazing intro there for you. And so I don't need to introduce myself too much, although I will say that with the dozen chickens in the backyard, I've moved back into my indoor office here so that we don't get interrupted by them. They have been very loud in the afternoon, in the afternoons or early, late mornings, which it's here in the San Francisco Bay Area today. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you today in the lead up to the publication of my book, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, and share with you some of the background and context for how this book came to be, as well as some of the insights from Mr. Yoshino and from myself about how to become or be a better people-centered leader in service of developing a learning organization. And so at the bottom here, I've gotten really some more clarity on my own purpose over the last year and thinking about this and trying to articulate it. But my purpose is really about helping people around the world to live and lead with intention. And I'll talk about that word intention in a few moments. You're here as people around the world to really help me do that. And this is why a core part of who I am is about sharing knowledge, collaborating, and helping each other get better as well, so that we can make the world better. And the book will be out in July, so pre-order is available now, so I'll tell you more about that. But a little background, this is a picture of my husband and Mr. Isao Yoshino and me on what I thought was going to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience back just over 5 years ago. Fast forward, or wind backwards, the year before we had found out that we had an opportunity to move to Japan for my husband's job. And it was amazing. I've lived in, as Graham had mentioned, I've lived in many countries. In fact, the only place in the US that I've lived is the San Francisco Bay Area. I've lived in Spain, in the Dominican Republic, in the UK, Australia, and then Japan as well. And I was really excited. Anyway, Mr. Yoshino, I met at a conference about 6 months before we moved to Japan. He said, and for a little context, for those of you who don't know who Mr. Yoshino is, he is a 40-year Toyota leader who worked in Japan and the United States in the 1960s to the early 2000s. He was John Shook's first boss at Toyota, John Shook being the former CEO of the Lean Enterprise Institute and the first non-Japanese employee of Toyota Motor Corporation. He helped lead the training program for the joint venture called NUMMI between General Motors and Toyota, when Toyota was looking to expand and translate its culture and production to the foreign markets. And he's just an amazingly generous of heart and thoughtful of mind leader. So he invited us to go to Nagoya, which is about 90-minute train ride from Tokyo. And I told my husband, you have to take the day off of work. This is going to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And little did I know that this one day was going to be incredibly transformative in my life and Mr. Yoshino has shared with me too, and the friendship and relationship we've developed out of it. I've learned so much from him, and that was the genesis of the book. When I first moved to Japan, I just, as a lean practitioner and a coach who had just started, I've been working in healthcare organizations for years and had started my consulting practice. I thought what an incredible opportunity to be someone who had this experience of practicing lean in the United States and other countries, but to then go to learn from the source. And so I started writing a blog, and Mr. Yoshino, on this day when we spent 8 hours together, he said, no problem, you can write about anything of our conversations. And so that first blog post became a series of what I called Lean Leadership Lessons, and was the original sort of idea that morphed into the book that will be coming out next month. And chronicling so much of Mr. Yoshino's 40 years of experience, and also some really valuable stories from a personal level about what it means to be a learner and a leader. So, I need to fast forward here. Mr. Yoshino said to me, probably about 6 months ago, as we were wrapping up the interviews and the production of the manuscript, he said, I'm learning and relearning more about my life. And I think this is the real power of reflection and looking back. And through this process of working intensely with Mr. Yoshino for the last 2 years, I've really come to appreciate how important the process of reflection is. And I always knew that reflection was important, but that it's not, when we think of the plan, do, study, adjust cycle, we often think of, we start with plan, but really it starts with that adjust, that reflection, that study. So how can we learn from the past, the things that happened, and then adjust for the future? And that can happen for the totality of our life, or on a sort of a micro PDCA cycle in our day. But how can we reflect more deeply and learn better? I also wanted to bring up this quote. Graham talked about my extensive Daruma collection, and here is a Daruma from Japan. I got obsessed with them while we were living in Japan, and they're a visual representation of setting a goal. So you can see this Daruma's eye here. It has its left eye filled in, and when you have a goal, you set that in, and you know that you're going to get knocked down, that you're not always going to be a linear course to achieving your goal. And so these are weighted. It's a little hard to see here, but it's weighted at the bottom, and it will always write itself back up. So how do we have the perseverance to keep getting up, to trying, reflecting, adjusting, and learning? So that's really sort of why I came to really love the concept of Darumas. And so one of the key words in the title of this is intention. And the word intention's always been a very meaningful word for me. How can we be a purposeful and intentional leader, and how we live our lives with intention? When I moved to Japan, I didn't have a business card, and you have to have business cards whenever you meet people, especially in a more of a professional setting. So I asked the business card company to put the word in Japanese for intention on my card, and I sort of used that at the time as my logo. And this is what it came back to saying. And as I started to hand it out, it's pronounced shiko. I started to hand it out, I learned that it comes from the symbols that make up this word come from 3 sub-symbols. And the lower part of this left one means heart, and the right, the ko, means direction. And I just came to see this as having a much deeper meaning for the word intention. And I've taken this now, how can we connect with our heart, what's really important inside of us, our purpose, and then align ourselves in that direction. So it's about having awareness about what's important inside, but not just having that awareness, but taking action and moving towards that and reorienting ourselves towards that. So for me, this is what leading and living with intention is. It's about knowing our purpose, what's important, and then taking the actions that move in that direction. One of the things that Mr. Yoshino said to me, and I think this is a quote from one of our very first meetings that I pulled out in an early blog post, is that he says the thing that really stands out for him about Toyota is that respect is about we make people while we make cars. And it's the focus on people-centered leadership. It's of course in service of delivering value to your customers, but first and foremost, it's about developing people. And I was really struck by, for those of you who haven't read Akio Toyoda's end of year speech, which was in the end of financial year, which is in April. speech, I recommend you do. And at the end, he says that the new mission for Toyota is about producing happiness, and I take that as joy, and really focusing on that respect for people and the things that bring us happiness and joy in life. And one of the things that is respectful is about developing people, and that can bring us happiness as we can be fully realized into our own capabilities and confidence for doing whatever it is that is our purpose in this world. So I do recommend taking a look at that speech. It's pretty special and powerful. And Mr. Yoshino, and then to connect this people-centered leadership concept to learning, Mr. Yoshino often talks about the only secret to Toyota is its attitude towards learning. So we often think about, oh my gosh, there are all these tools and principles and practices, but those are in service of a greater purpose, and it's about creating learning. And that concept of reflection is such an important part of how we learn and adjust. And that Toyota people are more patient for learning. My observation too is just in trying to practice lean in healthcare organizations here in the West, or working with other industries too, is that we're under so much pressure, and we don't feel like we have the time to slow down to do problem solving. So we have all these Band-Aid solutions that they're put on in the service of we don't have time. So having the patience to learn and the patience to develop people's learning capabilities is the real secret of Toyota. And I also wanted to link this to the concept of developing culture. And this quote came out of when Mr. Yoshino was talking about how he was tasked with developing this training program in Japan for the NUMMI leaders who were coming to learn the Toyota production system and the Toyota way. And he originally was tasked with, change their culture. And he realized that we can't change their culture, but what we can do is provide experiences that allow them to learn and then open up to being able to change themselves. It was for a moment. It's about how do we help each individual person have experiences that allow them to learn. And so as we go through the rest of the session here today, and we'll have time for questions, and if there are more questions we're not able to answer today, we've talked, Graham and Mike and I have talked about doing a follow-up session to answer some questions. So please continue to put your questions in the chat box as well. But we're going to talk about what are some of these leadership practices that can help support not just the culture of learning, but also real people-oriented, people-centered leadership that helps create this concept of happiness and engagement in our communities and our world. So rewinding a little bit to that first time I met Mr. Yoshino, this is before we moved to Japan at the conference. It was total serendipity that I happened to be at the conference, and that Mr. Yoshino he wasn't originally planned to be at the conference, the Lean Coaching Summit in Long Beach, but he happened to be in California at the time. And John Shook called him up on the phone and said, hey, why don't you come on the stage with me, and we can talk about our experiences of working together with you as my boss and me as your subordinate, as they called it at Toyota. And they told some really funny stories. And Mr. Yoshino was actually talking about how he had forgotten his underwear and was driving around looking for Walmart or something when John Shook had called him. So I already knew this was not a stoic, or it blew away all my preconceptions of what a Toyota leader was, or a sensei was like. Anyway, they were up on stage and he said some really profound things as well. And this comment has really struck me and has stayed with me since then, and is the foundation of how I talk about leadership. That his aim as a manager was to give John or whomever was working for him a mission or target, a challenge, and supporting him while he figured out how to reach that target. And as I was developing him, I was aware that I was developing myself as well. And this really is, I can sum it up, that a leader's role is to set the direction, to provide support, and to develop yourself. And if you can do those three things, then you're really a people-oriented, people-centered leader. And also you are going to create a system and culture of learning, because you're not rushing in and doing all the problem solving yourself. You're providing the support that allows people to develop those learning capabilities at all levels. And it also requires you to always be thinking about how you're getting better as a leader in service of setting the direction and providing support. So if you go to the poll, this would be the time for you to reflect for yourself on how much of your time is spent on these 3 key leadership capabilities. So I'm going to talk about some different practices that underlie or that are part of each of these 3 components, as well as a few tips at the very end that I've learned from my own practice about how to practice and create those habits. So first, the leader's role is to set the direction. So to provide a challenge, a goal, a target that help align people into what's most important to achieve. I have found in working with organizations and leaders and groups that so often this part is missing in our organizations. We make assumptions that people know the direction or know the target. This was not assumed at Toyota, and in many ways, if you think about it, for those of you who practice A3 thinking, it goes with background, current condition, the problem, and the target. The target's way down below because the target was clear. We need to start with the target. Where do we need to go? What is the direction? What is the challenge? And then understand what's the current condition, and then we can define the problem. So one thing that came out of my discussions with Mr. Yoshino is a real understanding that targets also should be determined by what is needed to deliver value for our customers, not by just what's achievable. I can't tell you how many meetings, and you've probably been in the same place before as well, that I've been in with leaders and organizations talking about targets that are tied to bonuses, that we need to like adjust the target so it's a little bit more achievable, and getting really granular on, do we think we can hit this target or not? Because our incentives are maybe not aligned with actually creating targets that are really about what is needed. So I encourage you too to think about how do the systems and structures that we have in our organizations inhibit us from actually setting challenges. Because as Mr. Yoshino says, it's the lessons from not reaching your targets that actually make you smarter. So we go back to what he said earlier about the only secret to Toyota is its attitude towards learning. It's about this as well. It's about how do you set the target so that you're always learning, you're never quite reaching it and getting there. And it's about the process of not getting there that you can reflect and learn and adjust, and it pushes you a little bit higher as well. I've been working with a group in the US as well recently, and we've talked a lot about how it's not about it. So this group was didn't know the target actually from their organization, and so we spent a lot of time talking about how can they get more clarity on the target, as well as not getting stuck about finding the perfect target. It's better to be directionally correct and then to keep learning your way towards that, because sometimes you discover what the actual precise target is through the learning process. Something that's been really important for me too is for us to recognize that it's not, leadership and in coaching is not just about always providing the challenge. It's a balance between this concept of challenge and nurture, setting the direction, setting a target that maybe is a little bit out of range, that feels a little uncomfortable, but also providing the nurture and support so that people don't feel like they're flailing. So that there is someone there who's going to help them. There is a safety net, that there is a process to help them and someone there. And so as leaders and as people and as coaches, I mean, I think about parenting as well. How do we challenge people to grow and develop, but also provide that support? And it's always just the fine balance about how we can do both at the same time. And I've been spending some time talking about this concept a lot, particularly in the pandemic when we've had so many challenges. How can we also be there to provide nurture? And that's a really important role of our people, of being a people-centered leader, is connecting with the heart as well. So the second part of people-centered leadership is about providing that support. So what does that look like? There are a lot of different things that you can do, and so I'm just highlighting a few here. And we share so many different stories from Mr. Yoshino's 40 years at Toyota in the book, but I want to highlight a few here for you and some of my own thoughts as well. And I like this quote from Mr. Yoshino. He says, "My role as a leader was to help others develop themselves." So again, we can't ever change someone's culture or change them, but we can provide them the experiences and create the conditions that allow them to learn, develop, grow, and to change. So the second thing that a people-centered leader can do is to set the conditions for success and to take responsibility for when mistakes happen. For those of you who have heard some of my webinars before talk about this book, there's a story from that Mr. Yoshino shared that he actually hadn't thought of in years and years. It was fun, came out during our first interview almost 2 years ago when we had sat down for purposeful conversation about this book. And he was laughing, remembering this about what an incredible experience it was for him. It's about creating the conditions for making mistakes. And this actually ran through his whole career at Toyota. Like a failed business venture that he led that lost Toyota $13 million at the end of his career, and that we go into detail with about in the book. But this experience that he had, and part of his orientation was to go work and office role that really didn't have anything to do with the shop floor, but they wanted people to learn what it was like to be working at Toyota of the people. So he was assigned to the paint shop in the Motomachi plant, and he claims he says it was a very boring. Every few hours, do it again as it ran low. Well, one day, Mr. Yoshino, who was actually Yoshino-kun at the time, which is the diminutive for like child, they turned to him and said, "What happened?" And I think in most situations, I think about if this had happened in almost any other organization I've been in, people immediately would have started blaming the person or yelling and saying, you know, "What happened? What did you do?" and have some anger. But no, they paused and they asked him to describe what he did and show what happened. And after they did, they realized that it was clear that the paint cans hadn't been labeled very correctly. So not only did the managers not blame Mr. Yoshino, they turned to him and thanked him for making the mistake, because it gave them an opportunity to create better conditions. They took responsibility that they had not labeled created any standard work or had labeled the paint and the solvent clearly, and so it was easy for him to make a mistake. And so now this gave them an opportunity to see that was an error or a gap on their behalf, and that they had not created the conditions for him to be successful at work. So it was a really powerful experience for him, and he said that happened across all of his cohort in his training session. People are putting wrong bolts into cars and whatnot, but they had quality inspections. But this gave them an opportunity to see where the gaps were in creating the conditions for people to do work correctly and with high quality. The third thing I talk about so much when I'm working with leaders and coaches is that as leaders, you don't own the process for learning, you don't own the outcome, you own the process. So this is where we don't tell people, we set the challenge, but it's about providing the support and helping them think about how to go about tackling that problem. It's about teaching them the process of learning and creating the conditions for learning, not us jumping in and giving all what we think are the right answers. So this requires patience to teach the process, and patience for not having the answer right now and immediately. But if you go back to the secret at Toyota, this is what they do really effectively. They have built in this expectation for their leaders to give time for learning and to support them. So one example from Mr. Yoshino's time is that, fast forward about 10 years, he was now in the Tokyo office, and he'd spent a few years in the Motomachi plant learning how to go to Gemba, how to go see how important that was. But now he was in another office role, and he was asked to prepare a report, and he felt really pressed for time. And so instead of going out to talk to some of the companies that he knew he needed to get firsthand information, he just went to the library. So the big boss, as he called it, asked him to come forward and share his report. And Mr. Yoshino, pulled out his A3 and started saying how he went about collecting the information. And the boss said, "Wait, you didn't go talk to these companies? Time out. You know how important it is to go to Gemba, to go talk to them. I don't want to hear any more of your report. I will give you 1 more week, and I want you to come back to having done the deepness of thinking that is required." Now, what was interesting is that later Mr. Yoshino found out that his boss knew that it was very unlikely that any of the information in the report would change, but that what he wanted to impress upon Mr. Yoshino at that time was the process of learning. So making sure that he had gone to sea, he had validated the data he'd collected from the library with facts from going out to sea, and that was the more important element that he was teaching as a leader, not just the outcome of the report. That was, again, very, very profound about how embedded this concept of learning and leader as coach for learning was already at the culture of Toyota at the time. And again, we're going to talk more about this at the end, and you can download the coaching questions guide that I've created to help people practice the art of asking questions. And it's so important, again, as leaders, if we come in and rush in and give all of the answers, we don't allow, and we give a target, but then come in and just answer what we think is the right answer, we don't allow that time for learning. So again, it's about giving that space for people to explore what they're thinking and allow them to get down to and have some time for failure or experimentation, and maybe going down a path that you didn't think was the right way, but may have greater discovery actually. And the more that people go through that learning process, they're going to be more effective leaders or learners themselves. A big thing that I think is so important is about focusing on the principle, not the tool. Mr. Yoshino played a big role in helping embed A3 thinking at Toyota, and in fact, John Shook credits Mr. Yoshino as one of the two main managers who helped teach him about the process of problem solving and using A3 thinking. We are so focused in our translation of the Toyota production system on the visible things, the tools, the formats, the structure, but this is not what is the most important. It's about the thinking process and how it supports learning. Mr. Yoshino tells a story about how he learned this when he was helping coach some senior executives on thinking, and he turned to his boss and said, this senior manager did not fill out the A3 how I would have expected him. And his more senior boss, who was who reported to Mr. Nomoto, who was sort of the Mr. Ono side of the people development of Toyota, and told him it doesn't matter as long as we can see his thinking and it follows the thought process. That's what's most important. It doesn't matter how he filled out the form. And I encourage you to think about that as well, as like, are we more focused on the forms and what the tool looks like than what the thinking process? And then are we actually doing ourselves a disservice because we're focusing on the wrong thing? And then the sixth part is making an extra effort. And this is a story I haven't actually shared with in any, I don't think in anywhere yet. And it was something that it just totally blew me away when I heard about Mr. Yoshino. And this is something that he did just as a manager. It wasn't anything special or required of him. It wasn't part of his job description. But one of his roles was to spend 4 years in California in supporting the NUMMI plant. And when he came back to Japan, he was given an assignment, and this was in the early 1990s, given an assignment in the Nagoya office. And he discovered that the people reporting to him, about 100, were doing just sort of regular office jobs, but didn't have much exposure to anything outside of Japan or even outside of the Nagoya area. And he decided that he was going to create a program that he called the Aesthetics Program, or Change Yourself. And it was this 9-month-long experience where he gave lectures and wrote articles and took his people out to dinner and really coached and developed them. But what was more amazing to me was that he found a way to get I think it was about 22 pairs of round trip tickets for people to go fly domestically or internationally. And he got the airlines to donate these tickets. And I mean, I can't think of many managers who go out of their way like this to make this happen, but he created an opportunity for people to expand their worldview who would never have had that opportunity before. And as we were reflecting sort of in the wrapping up stages of writing this book, he commented to me that it wasn't necessary, but it was meaningful to my people. And that really stuck out to me about how, as if we consider ourselves people-centered leaders, how can we do the small things? And that was actually a big thing, but how can we do small things that isn't necessarily part of our job description or considered necessary, but that can be meaningful? So I challenge us to all think about what are the ways that we can do little things each and every day that will have a meaningful impact to help develop and support other people. And then the third part of a leader's role is not just develop other people, is to develop ourselves. And that comes from a source of humility, of knowing that we all have opportunities for growing and developing, and that we aren't the source as leaders, or as, you know, as the more senior person, it's not about our answer. It's about helping develop other people. And that goes back to this concept of intention, sort of what's our purpose inside, and to have the humility know that we too need to always grow as well. And I've seen that helping develop other people is also a path to helping yourself develop. When I talked to Mr. Yoshino for the first time in Nagoya, from that picture with my husband, I asked him about that quote because it was so profound to me. And he didn't remember saying this, but then he talked a little bit more about his role in developing John, and then he was aware he was developing himself as well. But he said that he had this knowledge that he didn't always have the right answer for not just the problem that John or whomever was solving, but he didn't always know the right way to show up as the boss or the leader to help that person. And he had to do his own thinking and reflection on, how can I ask a better question? Or what does this person need for me to support them in their learning? And so he's always challenging himself about how he could do that better and more effectively. So I have 3 practices that I have found incredibly helpful for me to develop myself, but also in service of developing other people. So the first, I call it taking an intention pause. So for me, this is about taking just a moment to ground myself in what is my purpose in this moment, and then what are the things I need to do to show up that way. Because so often I've had the experience where I'm, sometimes I'm the boss, sometimes I'm the coach, sometimes I'm a peer, and I'm running from meeting to meeting. And it's really hard to know, we get in the habit of telling and responding and giving all of our ideas, which is totally appropriate in some cases, especially when we're there to set the direction, or if we're a parent and we need to tell. But in many cases, that habit we've developed isn't in alignment with our purpose in that moment. So for example, if our purpose in that moment is to really provide support, what are the things that we need to do to provide support? And it helps me to take this intention pause to kind of remind myself of that role, and what are the few key things that I'm going to do that align myself in that direction with my actions. And that has helped me develop better practices of listening, asking more effective questions, not jumping in and interrupting people, and so many other things. So this has been helpful for me to create those habits. The second thing is to pay better attention to the quality of your questions. So I have more information in the coaching guide here. There are many different types of questions and ways and when you can ask questions. But what I want you to pay attention to is, so often we think we're asking a question. That is our intention, where we know we should be asking a question in that moment, but that we're actually asking a fake question. So we're asking a leading question or a closed-ended question, or offering multiple choices, which limit the answers. So I want you to pay attention and think about, are you asking a real humble inquiry question, which is asked for the intention of helping the other person think more deeply about their situation or problem? And typically, these questions are those that start with what or how. So if you can ask a question that starts with what or how, this is more likely a real humble inquiry question. Although I do want to caution you, going back to the slide, that what if you tried my great idea, or what if you tried my thought, or how about thinking about whatever I'm thinking about? That is not a humble inquiry question. So pay attention. Oh, I forgot to mention, I'm so used to seeing this animal. This is a weird animal. It's actually a wolf disguised as a sheep. So these are our questions dressed, our thinking, our ideas, our suggestions dressed up as questions. So really pay attention to that. And then, how do we listen? Are we really listening with open ears, seeing with open eyes, with an open mind, and with an open heart? These are drawings done by my friend and coaching partner, Karen Ross, and is a key part of what we talk about. It's not just asking questions, but it's also listening and really hearing without assumptions and getting back to that sense of caring and people-centeredness about what people are saying, the things that are obvious and visible and that you're hearing, and the things that may not be visible as well. And going back to this concept of failure, in the last part of the book, we talk about a 10-year-long experience, actually a new business venture that Mr. Yoshino had that was pretty great, but it failed. And it was a hard time for him to talk about, but he did reflect that failure isn't failure if you can learn something important you've never could learn elsewhere. And so how do we also have that mentality as leaders and as people about how can we learn from failure? And again, going back to that concept of reflection. And to remind ourselves that learning is never perfect and it's never complete. This is the constant PDCA cycle. And I'd like to say that writing a book is never perfect and it's never complete. And I'm having to remind myself that, especially right now, I'm in the final editing process. And I'm really excited to get the book out to you all so you can really read in detail the stories that Mr. Yoshino, that I've had the privilege of hearing and helping him synthesize and reflect on, of his stories of learning and leading with other people as well. So before we move on to questions, I want you to reflect for one moment too about your own intention, and to say one thing that you will practice with intention to become a more people-centered leader. And we would like people to put those in the comments as well. We'd really love to see what you're thinking about. And then just my contact information. I love to hear from people and connect. All my contact information's here. If you're wanting to practice more people-centered leadership skills and be part of a community, Karen Ross and I offer our K2C2, Karen and Katie's coaching community regularly, and we're doing a special session on listening coming up. And of course, the book's coming out in July. Pre-order is available now on Amazon, or you can go to the book's website here. Unfortunately, outside of the US right now, the paperback pre-order is not available, but it will be available in all regions that Amazon ships to once the book is officially released on July 15th, but the Kindle pre-order is available. So I'm really looking forward to answering your questions and having a dialogue here and a conversation. And again, thank you to Mike and to Graham for inviting me to be here and to share some of the stories and experiences with you all. This is the exciting part about finishing a book and moving on, is now talking about it.
You must be so ready for that point to actually get it out there and share all this with people.
I am. I'm ready to be not working in the book, but like being on and like really hearing people's how Mr. Yoshino's stories and our shared reflections impact people. But something I didn't share, actually, I had this big pivot moment. It was a year ago. It was like last June, July. I'd been working on writing the book and had been sitting down, and I was just stuck because my original view of how the book would be structured was not what was flowing. And I realized Mr. Yoshino's, his personal story of learning and leading needed to unfold, how it unfolded. And so this is not a how-to book. This is really about one leader's learning journey, but also talks about some really important times in history at Toyota as well.
Absolutely. Mike, I'm gonna open it up to you now. You've been sort of hosting the questions, so you guys can just engage in a bit of Q&A for the last sort of 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, so I'll pick out the first question that came up and distracted you, Katie, just so that it makes some value. How do you help leaders who just don't want to stop looking for, they use the word instant pudding, but I guess the quick fix? What experience did you get from Yoshino-san on that? Yeah,
so I would... So patience would be the number one, and how, I mean, it's hard. Again, we can't change other people, but we can give them opportunities to see. So I would say, how can you start modeling the way for what that looks like? How do you ask maybe just a few more questions that help that person also think a little bit more deeply about the quick, it may have been a quick fix. How do we slow down just a tiny bit? So it doesn't happen overnight. Like, I work with organizations, especially in healthcare, where it's so used to everything being a crisis that needs to be answered now. So when I'm working when I was in those organizations and now help support them here, it's like, okay, so even if we needed to put an immediate solution there, how do we then go back and actually do a little bit deeper problem solving so that we can see is that Band-Aid that we put on, did it actually have the impact that we thought? And so how do we just little bit by little bit start to get better at doing that? And I think it's just by asking some of those questions and taking some time to understand the impact of the things.
Sounds like it's more of an experiential thing, helping them go through that experience of learning so that they don't feel they need to jump to conclusions about things.
Yes,
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen overnight.
What did Yoshino-san talk about the Japanese belief about failure? It says, what is the Japanese belief about failure? Is it a Japanese thing or is it a Toyota thing?
So I don't, he hasn't specifically ever talked to me about if it's a Japanese thing. And in fact, I would think in many ways, it sort of runs counter to what my experience was about Japanese culture, where failure, the harikuri, the failure is you kill yourself if you failed. And well, Japanese culture and Toyota culture are actually very, there's some similarities and some things that that fit together, but some of the things that Toyota did, actually I see as countermeasures to elements of Japanese culture and practice. So I can't answer to what Mr. Yoshino would say about that, but from his experience at Toyota, the company and the people within the company embraced failure in a very different way than perhaps I know in other organizations in Japan and in other areas as well.
Christine asked a question. She said, is it just the leader's responsibility to set the challenge? Surely employees should also have a say in shaping the direction so that they have ownership.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm thinking also back to the group that I've been working with here. So yes, and that's the whole, there should be a conversation and an input, but ultimately the leaders own that decision making of what is the direction we're going to go in. But absolutely, and that's of engaging in a dialogue to understand what's going on in the organization and what's happening, and maybe the people closer to the work set the individual targets that they need to take to be able to move in that direction. But there does need to be some knowledge about what do we need to achieve, what's our highest level purpose as an organization, and how do all the things that we're doing connect down to that. If we let everyone just sort of choose what direction they want to go, we may have a lot of work that's happening but not in alignment. So yes, there needs to be some engagement and some discussion, and that's what Toyota has done very well with their Hoshin Kanri practice of talking, there's input at all levels and then it comes back up. And each group is able to set its own targets that it needs to, and goals as it relates to that direction. But again, there is strong alignment there. So I think I would say it's both.
Certainly that's been my experience anyway, because there's a full engagement, but not necessarily a directional setting from further into the organization, because they often don't have the full picture. Hernan asked, what would you say are the basic organization traits that need to be in place before we attempt to get everybody on board with a new learning organizational culture?
So that's a good question too. I don't think you can wait for everyone to get on board. That's never going to happen. So again, I would say that it's about, you can start at any level, but it's about starting to engage people and asking more questions. And how do you, leaders at all levels, the more that you can ask those questions and allow people to contribute their thoughts, that will start to develop the learning organization. I mean, if you think back to the amazing story of Numi, and it's written about before. I mean, it's the same thing that Mr. Yoshino was tasked at. They had this going into a culture that was where people were voluntarily, actively destroying cars and it was a really horrible culture. And within 1 year, they created those conditions for people to see a different way. And so it didn't happen overnight, But again, it's about giving people experiences, and also leaders showing up and not blaming them immediately, and not attacking personally, but creating a little more space. But I don't think you can create all the conditions that are going to be perfect. It's about it grows a bit organically, person by person. What do you think, Mike? Because I know you've had some experience both at Toyota and working with a lot of other organizations too.
It's interesting because the way that you put that, I'm going to relate that to another question that someone's just put here. Marina's just asked the question: would you put a massive, scary challenge or play gently? And that comes back to the way that you explained the balancing of challenge and nurturing, and it's a fine line. So for some people, a scary challenge is exactly right for where they need to go to, but then it's the reassurance and the support that fits behind it. What's your experience on that?
Absolutely. So if you have just the scary challenge, but not having the nurture element, the true people-centered leadership aspects, well, that creates a culture of fear and blame and bad things. But if you're only nurture and have no direction or no challenge that allows you to grow and sort of leap into maybe ways that you didn't think were possible because it felt safe, then are you really sort of pushing the innovation and continuous improvement? So you can't have one without the other to really be a learning, people-centered organization. So you see those sort of cultures, you see two different cultures that maybe you don't want out of that.
After having left Toyota, I read a really clever book by a guy by the name of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called Flow. And in that book, he talks very much around the idea of balancing challenge and support or skills. And it's the same thing, really. And I never realized it at Toyota, but that's exactly what they were doing. They'd stretch you and then reassure you, stretch you and reassure you. And so you're constantly in this evolutionary growth, and you enjoy it. You like being in that place. Right,
because you know that they're never going to like totally have the floor fall out from under you, but they're not going to just give you the answer right away either. And so one of my observations about here in the West is we are more uncomfortable with this concept of struggle. So, and there's actually been some, I'll have to send you some articles. Mike Rother had sent these to me about how in Japan, even in elementary schools, they allow kids to struggle a little bit more before giving the answer, before the teacher comes in. And we are uncomfortable with that concept of struggle, but struggling is where the learning comes in. But also not struggling where they're gonna you're gonna drown, because it's struggling with nurture. And we need to get more comfortable with having a little struggle, but knowing that there's the support there.
Susan asked a good question. She commented and said, great webinar, Katie. Why do you think few leaders exhibit the leadership qualities that you spoke about?
That's a great question. I think because we are, at least I think back to myself and how I've had to really put attention to how I'm showing up. Because I always have loved helping develop people, and I think people really do come to work wanting to do the right thing and come from a place of caring for the most part. But that we are so habituated to being the one we're rewarded for having the right answer, or we feel time constraints that we have to get this done now. And so because we have been creating that habit, sort of we collectively enable each other and that to happen as well. I mean, there's even some Mr. Yoshino, even at this end of his career, this boat business failure, he didn't do some of the things he knew he needed to do because actually talking to his people about the target and the goal, and he just sort of did it because he felt under time pressure. And so we all have this human habit. We have to put real intention to what is our purpose, what are we trying to achieve, what's important, and then how are we what are the things we need to do to line up with that and to counter the things that have been so ingrained in us, in our cultures and in our
Someone said, I'm trying to look.
Just one more question, Mike, if that's okay.
Okay. It said, how do you make time for learning? How do you make sure there's time for learning? That was from Jane Muller. I think that's a great question.
That is a great question. Also, for the rhetorical, how do you not make time for learning? I mean, this is the big challenge, right? How do we make the time? We feel like everything is urgent and needs to happen now. But think about how many meetings, if you're in the same organization, you've been in for a few years, you go to the same meeting talking about the same problem over and over again. So we're spending all this time solving for the same problem because we actually haven't taken the time for problem solving. So how can we even, as I said earlier, just take 15 more minutes or 10 minutes to have some reflection or to ask a few more questions, and through that start to create the more capability and capacity for deeper problem solving. But we're just sort of on this hamster wheel of Band-Aids and urgency because we're not actually addressing the things that we need to address.
That's a really interesting one. In terms of the poll results, and that really resonates with what people have shared with us on that. In terms of the total amount of time that people spend on those 3 attributes of being a really, really effective leader, the biggest category was between 20 and 40%. That scored 36% of the vote. So that just really starts telling you that actually the majority of time is spent not doing those things. And how much more effective would people be if they could somehow manage to get another 5 or 10%? That would feel like a profound difference to their teams in terms of being able to lead, in a different way.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that when I work with clients in helping them do this is even just how can you take 5 to 10 minutes each day, this is their homework assignment, to reflect on the day and set their plan or their intention. And just that small habit of doing that and writing it down starts to create more problems. It just creates more focus up here and thinking, and it sort of starts to create that habit that then has this sort of a ripple effect with the people that they're working with.
My experience is I think a lot of people get confused with learning. They think that learning is something that you do away from work. But the reality is, in my experience with Toyota, all the learning was virtually done on the job. Although there was days that were happening to develop new concepts and skills, but all the learning was done on the job, solving problems, making improvements, making decisions, working through things. And if the leader is there engaging with people and asking them questions, then you're stretching the learning. That's the way
I just want to say a really huge thank you to Katie again for her time. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, just listening to you talking to Mike, we could go on, probably into the early hours, although some of the audience in Japan, it already is in the early hours, but you know what I mean. So I hope everybody would agree with me that your approach and your insight is fantastic. I'm really looking forward to seeing the book. So thank you again.
And we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody out there for dialing in today. Good luck to you all. Stay safe.
Yeah.
Look after each other in these difficult times. All the best. Goodbye.
Okay.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.